Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. I'm sorry that we don't have more pleasant things to talk about. I'm sorry that the news cycle is what it is, but I think people have gotten maybe inured to that. I hope not numb to it. We have another shooting again in Tulsa once again. And of course, we're being assured that there's not much that can be done about it, of course, except to up armor all of our schools and now our hospitals, apparently bars, country music festivals, churches, synagogues, because we apparently continue to be the only country in the world that watches this, is shocked and horrified, and then decides, yeah, we can't really do anything about the guns. I don't think I'm being excessively cynical here. I think I'm just simply describing the political reality, although I would strongly urge readers to check out Mona Charen's piece about the myths about gun ownership, walking through more than 20 recent incidents and pointing out how, in fact, if we did have laws, they could make a difference. The problem, of course, is not whether or not we could do something to reduce American carnage. It's whether or not we are willing to do something. So, with that dark beginning, welcoming back to the podcast, Dr. Russell Moore, public theologian at Christianity Today, director of Christianity Today's Public Theology Project, also a fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, minister in residence at Emmanuel, Nashville, and author of Courage to Stand, Facing Your Fear Without Losing Your Soul. First of all, good morning, Dr. Moore.
Good morning.
The reason I wanted to talk to you is this extraordinary piece that you wrote last week about sexual abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention, where you said it's not a crisis, it's an apocalypse. And I want to get to that in just a moment. But I'm looking at the title of your book, Courage to Stand, Facing Your Fear Without Losing Your Soul. And I guess I wanted to ask you about that because we live in a time in which there is so much fear. There are so many things to be afraid about. And I wonder
Mhm.
what do what are you thinking about as you watch this? What can you say to people who are experiencing losses that I know the word is overused, but unimaginable?
Yeah.
I remember the adage, that God will not give you more than you can handle. But I have to say that when I watch what's happened in places like Uvalde, I have to ask, is this more than people should handle to be a mother or father and to bury your child who's been murdered in these terrible ways? How do you face your fear without losing your soul?
Well, the situation of the parents themselves, that's unimaginable. It's unimaginable under any circumstances. And then you add to it all of the confusion in Uvalde itself about how this could have been prevented, whether it could have been prevented, what the police did or did not do. It just adds to what is already horror. And then if you look at the rest of us just out here in America, and you see the way that we tend to cope with these things, it's by just forgetting about it.
Yeah.
And so you just look at that. Axios had a study showing how quickly people just forget these things and move on. And they suggested it wasn't really callousness or numbness; it's that people are overwhelmed,
Yeah.
and so they just choose not to think about it. And then you add to it, most people really feel completely powerless here. They really don't believe whatever they think should be done in terms of guns or in terms of mental health or in terms of anything else. They don't really think anything is going to be done because they've seen Newtown and everything else since then. And a lot of people have just given up to a kind of cynicism, as you said.
Well, there's also just the psychological protective mechanism of if you can't deal with something, you'll find a way not to think about it. But also, what you're describing is a loss of hope, which is also would be at the roots of a spiritual crisis if people lose hope.
Yes, and you just look at everything over the last several years, and how many times we thought COVID's gone, we can finally emerge from the stress of that, and then it just hits right back. Everything else, it gets to the point where people have become really disillusioned. One of the things that's really helpful to me is to go back and reread C.S. Lewis's essay "Learning in Wartime."
Hmm.
Where he's talking to students at Oxford at the beginning of World War II, answering the question, "Why do you even bother when it seems that the world is falling
Hmm.
apart?" And he says, "You have a sense of powerlessness. You understand that, but you actually always do. we are always helpless and powerless. We're going to die. This just intensifies it, and you can see it. And it can lead you to a kind of disillusionment where you just give up, or it can lead you to the right kind of disillusionment, which is a loss of the illusions and a sense of dependence on God or dependence on one another. And so I'm hoping for that second kind of disillusionment right now.
Well, I have to tell you, as soon as we're done recording this podcast, I'm going to go look that up. I have all the works of C.S. Lewis here, so I'm sure that I have it, and I feel the need to reread that. So let's talk about the other crisis, the shocking apocalyptic crisis of the Southern Baptist Conference. You, for many years, until recently, served as the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is the public policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. So, and you resigned last year. And so you have been involved in this very deeply and very intimately. And when this new report came out about sexual abuse at the Southern Baptist Convention, you wrote in Christianity Today that crisis was too small a word. It is an apocalypse. Give me your sense on this, because you wrote that you didn't expect to be surprised because you were very
Right.
familiar with what had gone on. You thought you had a sense, and yet this report comes out. So tell me about what was in the report.
I was the one who called for an investigation as I left. And so I thought I will be the person who's the least surprised
Right.
by anything that they find. And I was literally mouth open, just in a state of disbelief and furious. And part of that is because for so many years we had said we have a crisis, we have to address it. And many of the same people in this report, in this third party investigation, would say it's not a crisis, don't call it a crisis. And now I'm looking at this and saying this is far worse than a crisis. I mean, this is an existential apocalypse taking place if you think of it as an unveiling of what's really going on. So, for instance, so one of the things that the third party investigation revealed is that for many years, people have been calling for a database to keep pastors who are predators or others who are predators at a church from just moving from one church to the other. And the next church doesn't have any idea what's happened. And the executive committee would always say, we can't do that. We've studied it. There's no way to keep track of this. Now we find out they actually had a kind of a database, a shadow database for themselves. But it wasn't to protect vulnerable people, it was to keep track of it all, I suppose, to protect their own legal liability. And then when you just look at the conversations here about sexual abuse victims and survivors, the numbness and the uh, inhumanity of those conversations, it's really shocking to the system. And of course, I was familiar with the way there are all of these stonewalling obstacles to any kind of reform and retaliation against people who say that there ought to be change. And it really was a shocking
Yeah.
investigation, and many people are reeling right now.
So you wrote that, as dark a view as you had of the executive committee, the investigation uncovered a reality far more evil and systemic than I imagined it could be. And the conclusions were so massive as to defy summation. But can we just get a sort of a sense of why you describe this as an apocalypse? It's not just the scope of it, the number of
Yeah.
people involved. It is the people who participated, and it goes so high into the conference and so far back to the beginnings. Okay, you tell me whether I'm wrong, but so many major seminal figures, revered figures, are implicated in this. That's what makes this so really stunning.
It really is, and it's including some figures who are there aren't many people who are respected across all of the different divisions within the denomination, but in some cases, even they were implicated here. So it's just the report. It's about 200 pages long, and every page is astounding. For so long, I assumed that the problem here was that people just really didn't understand it.
Right.
They didn't understand that this was happening. But according to this report, at least this group of people did understand it. They did know the extent of what was happening, and refused to do anything because they wanted to protect themselves.
Okay, did they wanna protect themselves? I mean, did they rationalize this? They wrap this in, we're not protecting ourselves, we're protecting our witness, we're protecting people's faith. I mean, how did the process work that you would look at sex abuse, you would see victims, you understood that there were predators out there, and you kept track of it, you wrote it down, you knew about it, and then you convinced yourself that the right thing to do was to do nothing?
Well, it's like in a lot of institutions in American life right now. There's the rationalization that says, look at all the good we do. We send more missionaries than anyone else. They're caring for people all over the world. And if we're not doing that, there are a lot of people who are going to be hurt.
Yeah,
So,
right.
therefore, we need to protect the institution to make sure that we can continue to do that. And so, when someone will come up and say, we have a serious problem here, a couple things happen. One of those things is to say, you're going to hurt our missionaries. You're going to hurt all the good work that we do. And the second thing is an implicit sort of threat of exile. It's if you speak on this, you're not really one of us. And so that's what happened with many sexual abuse survivors. I experienced it a little bit as in my own way, but nothing compared to the way they did. But if you raise this, you're being disloyal, and that means that you're out, and that's a big a sort of not just a psychological factor, but a spiritual reality for a lot of us who were raised. I mean, I first sound I ever heard must have been my mother's heartbeat, but the second would have been Amazing Grace on a piano. I mean, those of us who have been in a Southern Baptist church context all of our lives, we love it. We love those people. There's a spiritual dimension to it as well.
So you're right that we were told that they wanted to conserve the old time religion. What they wanted was to conquer their enemies and to make stained glass windows honoring themselves, no matter who was hurt along the way. So at some point, does it all morph the religious mission, the witness? Does it morphs into the pursuit of power?
Yes, but what happens is we have sort of a mythology or had sort of a mythology in the Southern Baptist Convention of the conservative resurgence. And because there were some real leftward theological problems, a group of people who came in and said, no, we're going to reclaim authority of Scripture and so forth. They're speaking to people who had genuine concerns about those things, including me. I'm very theologically conservative. But what we see now is that many of those figures um, they were picking an issue that resonated for legitimate reasons with a lot of people, but they were actually in this for the most ruthless sort of power. And so you look back and you say there are some people who were called liberals and sort of put out of the circle that genuinely were. They were theological liberals that just didn't fit
Mhm.
within a Southern Baptist doctrine. But there were a lot of other people who were sort of labeled that in a way in which they're now gone. I think about this all the time. A conversation you had, I think, with Adam Kinzinger a
Mhm.
year or so ago, where you were talking about this influence loop that what you're told is you have to be at the table to change
Right.
things, so play by the rules. And then when the moment comes when one has to say, "This is a problem, we need to fix it," then you're out of the table. And
Yeah.
so it just perpetuates the power struggle.
Yeah, it is a loop of rationalization. So you made reference to this, and this is a bit of inside baseball for people who are not Southern Baptists. But I think it's key to understanding the evolution that you're describing of the modern conference. You tell the story of this legendary meeting back in 1967 at a cafe in New Orleans where two men were very well known in Baptist circles, probably less well known, outside.
Mhm.
Two men named Paige Patterson and Paul Pressler sat down and they mapped out how they wanted to unite, as you point out, conservative Southern Baptists to take over the convention. And this was, as you pointed out, the conservative resurgence. Others thought of it as a fundamentalist takeover. But as you just described, you were taught that this is how you were
Mhm.
saved. The conference was saved from the heresies of liberals by the courage of these two men. But
Yeah.
it turns out that these two guys are really inextricably, wound up in what what had gone terribly wrong. So tell me about this. I mean, Patterson fired for mishandling a rape victims report, making
Yes.
comments. What happened to Patterson?
There were videotaped comments about the physical appearance of 16-year-old girls as sort of parenthetical sermon illustrations, and then added to the mishandling of some of these things. He was fired. The other figure is now in a civil trial over accusations of sexual assault.
This is Paul
Um,
Pressler, right?
Paul Pressler, yes, and so he's that's all alleged. I mean, it's still in court right now. But the fact is that here you have a situation where for a lot of people these were sort of the Martin Luthers of the current time period in our part of the world. And so to see this, it really has a rattling sort of effect, because what you do is you look back and you say, well, then what was I doing all that time? And what then was real, and what was an illusion? And so I tell people all the time, I am just really glad that I was a Christian for as long before I sort of went behind these walls to see some of these things. I can tell the difference between Jesus and this stuff, but a lot of people can't. And
Hmm.
so you have a rattling of people's faith in ways that it's disturbing to me when I see young people who are saying, "I'm just walking away from the faith," not because they say, "Oh, I listen to Richard Dawkins and I believe him," or "I don't want to abide by the moral rules of the church." That stuff always happens. But when they say, "I just don't even believe this is real," in terms of actually morally real, I mean, that is heartbreaking and a crisis, and could be avoided. In one of the recordings that was made, which I didn't even remember until I saw the recordings, I didn't know were happening. I said to one of these figures, because he was saying to me, "You can't raise these issues in public because we've got to protect the base,
Good.
and the base doesn't like this, and we've got to protect the base." And I just said, "Stop doing stupid stuff." And now that I look back on that, I say that actually was so understated, because so much of this isn't stupid stuff; it's just wicked, and self-evidently wicked. I think that's just throwing a lot of people right now.
So let's talk about this culture, the rot in the culture that you describe. And I want to go into that, but let's do that right after this. Have you ever heard of data brokers? They're the middlemen who are collecting and selling all of those digital footprints you leave online. They can stitch together detailed profiles, which include your browsing history, online searches, and location data. And then they sell your profile off to a company who delivers you a targeted ad. Now, no biggie, right? Well, you might be surprised to learn that these same data brokers are also selling your information to the Department of Homeland Security and the IRS. Look, I personally don't want the tax man showing up at my door because of some search I did on my phone. So, to mask my digital footprints, I protect myself with ExpressVPN. One of the easiest ways for brokers to aggregate data and tie it back to you is through your device's unique IP address, which also reveals lots of information about your location. When you're connected to ExpressVPN, your IP address is hidden. That makes it much more difficult for data brokers to identify who you are. ExpressVPN also encrypts 100% of network traffic to keep your data safe from hackers on public Wi Fi. That's why I have the ExpressVPN app downloaded on all of my devices, phone, computer, even my home Wi Fi router. All I do is tap one button to turn it on, and I'm protected. It's that easy. So, to make sure your online activity and data is protected with the best VPN money can buy, visit expressvpn.com/bulwark right now and get 3 extra months free through my special link. That's expressvpn.com/bulwark, expressvpn.com/bulwark to learn more. We are back with Dr. Russell Moore, who wrote a really extraordinary piece in Christianity Today last week about sex abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention, saying it is not just a crisis, it is an apocalypse. And you called out the rot in the culture, the same culture that exiles churches that call a woman on staff a pastor, but and that treats women wearing leggings as a social media crisis, but thinks that rape in the church is a distraction. I thought that was well put. It's like you get upset about this, but then you have these horrific examples of abuse, and that's a distraction. That is what is the threat to the mission.
Yeah, and it's often with these sort of mafia tactics. I mean, there was a figure in Southern Baptist life who was really revered, and sort of the lore about him is that if you got out of his favor, he would send you flowers, and if you received these flowers, that would mean you're no longer in the good graces with this leader.
Jeez.
And I remember the first time I heard someone talking about this and thinking, this sounds like the mafia to me. This doesn't sound like the Jesus loving Southern Baptist church that I grew up in and that I've known ever since. And there really is, usually not in that cartoonish a way, but there really is often in these institutions a sense of not we're going to exile you immediately. Think about Tim Alberta's piece
Hmm.
from a couple weeks ago about these things
Right.
that are going on in churches.
The radicalization.
Yeah, often what happens is for the pastors who are under siege there, it's not the immediate issue. It's a group of people who sort of step back and wait. They don't say anything about what they're really angry about, but they wait until they can find something else and then just project all of their tactics on that. And so you can end up with a situation I really believe this. Most people in the Southern Baptist Convention are good people who really do want to serve the Lord. But it only takes a small group of people to completely control the agenda of what's being talked about. And that can happen congregation by congregation by congregation. You may say, well, it's only 10% of the people in my church. And yet, I mean, you just look at the CRT. I mean, there's
Yeah.
CRT controversies everywhere, but we were having them in the SBC a full 2 years before the rest of the country. And I'm not a critical race theorist at all, but and as a matter of fact, I couldn't find a critical race theorist. It would be easier for me to find a Southern Baptist vegan at a men's prayer breakfast than it would for me to be able to find a critical race theorist. But you had people who all they were doing is saying, look, here's what the Bible teaches about justice. Here are the very real problems we have with race. Here's how we ought to bear the burdens of our African American and other fellow Christians, and that is labeled as CRT. And so what happens is then you have people they don't want to defend CRT. They don't believe in CRT, but they have to constantly be dealing with the accusation, oh well, you're a critical race theorist. And then when the other people just sort of step back and say, if we just denounce this non-existent in our context CRT loudly enough, then that will settle this group down and then we can move forward. But that's not that doesn't happen. And
Gotcha.
so there's just a
You feed
constant
it. Yeah.
demand for more and more.
So, and the way in which survivors and dissenters are treated, I want to talk about that because, and let's just talk about the abuse survivors. The report documents how the arguments were used that these people who were coming forward were quote unquote professional victims, right?
Yeah.
And that if you stood by them, you would be a tool of the devil to distract from the mission. So part of it was kind of demonizing the victims themselves and then anyone that would speak up in the way that you just described, correct?
Yes, and also this sense of, well, this is the culture. The Me Too movement is the culture, and if you have this understanding that the culture is completely rotten on the outside, then well, this is a fad, or maybe it's something more dangerous than that. It's some sort of a feminist agenda, and so therefore we shouldn't pay attention to it. which is just mind-boggling because I think, in what universe is it inconsistent to follow Jesus and to protect the very people he told us to protect? It just doesn't make sense. But that is for a lot of people the mindset that they have. If this sort of thing is it's professional victim that comes up a lot, victim Inc., or
Hmm.
just the sense of well, we're all sort of absorbing and playing to the culture on the outside.
So, and you're right, the people who stepped out of line were labeled liberals, Marxists, or feminists. And of course, you've taken a lot of brickbats over the years. So, one of the stories you recount in the article is that when you and your wife stepped out of the last Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee meeting that they would ever attend, she told you that if you remained a Southern Baptist, you would have an interfaith marriage because
Yeah, yeah,
she'd seen enough and
she'd
so
seen
had
enough.
you. So what happened at that meeting that caused that?
We brought my then 15-year-old son with me because he had asked my wife, he said, "Look, I can handle this. Just tell me, has dad had some sort of moral failure or stolen money or something like
Ooh.
that?" And so I said, "I want you to come with me. So I want you to hear all of it and then you'll know." And so he did. And we sat through all of it and then we walked out. And I said, "What did you
All of
think?"
what? What happened? So
Well,
were you on trial? Was
yes,
this
yes, it was, a kind of a trial, I guess you would call it. And so when we walked out, I said, "What did you think?" And he said, "Well," he said, "I feel a lot better about you than I did before, hearing all that. But my question is, why do we want to be a part of this?" He said, "Dad, that was so angry and it was so disorganized. Why do we want to be a part of this?" And that was a really difficult moment. And my wife, who does not give ultimatums, I don't think I've ever heard her give one before, said that. She said, "You can do what you want," because she knew I have had such a loyalty to Southern Baptists that it left to myself, I would have stayed there until, if necessary, I was the last one to turn off the last water heater for the last baptistry. She knew that. And so she knew it would take a lot for me to leave. But we were at the point where I just said, I can't stay and figure out how to keep my ordination vows.
So I was thinking about this, and I don't want to wallow in this, but when I wrote my book, How the Right Lost Its Mind back in
Mhm.
2016, 2017, I basically devoted an entire chapter to you because it was so rare for a prominent evangelical leader to resist the push to get on board the Trump train. And you were very, very outspoken about that. And yet you managed to hang on for 3 or 4 years. It
Mhm.
must have been brutal. I mean, at what point does this other issue become the breaking point? There seems to be kind of this stew of the politics, the radicalization, the attitude towards sex abuse. You were able to hang on for a long time, and then it became intolerable. So can you describe that breaking point?
It wasn't just hang on because when you think about the way the Southern Baptist Convention is governed is with a big annual meeting where churches send people to make decisions. I never received anything from them that was not encouragement, affirmation, cooperation. I would walk away from that meeting every year feeling re-energized. And my board was great. I had nothing but support and encouragement from my board the entire time that I was there. So it wasn't a situation where most people, including most Trump voters, I mean, I had countless people who disagreed with me on Trump and would say I voted for Trump, but I understand why you don't. But it was a smaller group who are willing to do anything. I mean, that's why in a lot of these institutions, things are really mismatched because even if you have the majority of people who are willing to bear with some difference and cooperate together, that smaller group often is willing to use whatever psychological or other tactics they can get. And the majority, they just don't understand that because they think, I wouldn't do anything like that. And so if we just sort of let these people get it through their system, then everything will be fine. And then there are a lot of other people. It's really similar to the political scene. There are a lot of people who are scared, who are in some position of leadership, who are just sort of saying, "Well, I have to kind of look around and see who should I be standing next to and not standing next to, and what should I say and not say." And a lot of times in church life, it's exactly like it is, say, in Congress. You have people saying, "Well, I'm going to go along with this for now, but eventually the fever will break, and then everything will go back to normal. But I have to be at the table when things go back to normal in order to lead it." And that means right now I have to give them what they want. And there was someone who said to me in 2016, right after the election, there was a group of people who were, went to the Wall Street Journal to say they were going to try to defund me and have me fired. And this person said to me, "Well, you've got to play the game the right way. And that is, you give them 95% red meat that they want, and then you can deal with the 5% that you want to do." And my response was to say, "I didn't know we were playing a game." That's what's news to me.
So give me your sense of the trajectory here, because obviously you have this process of radicalization, in some cases extreme radicalization. I'm thinking of Tim Alberta's piece.
Mhm.
It happened over a long period of time, happened gradually, and then felt like it happened all at once. He thinks that the pandemic and the shutdown accelerated a lot of things that were going on. You saw this from the inside. So give me your sense of sort of the historical roadmap, how we got to this point. Because for me, and one of the reasons I was so interested in what you were saying back in 2016 it came as a genuine shock to me as an outsider to watch how evangelical Christians went from the demographic group that was most interested in the relationship of private virtue to public figures, thought it was the most important issue, to the demographic group most willing to say that virtue, character did not matter when it came to politics. It felt like just a complete reversal, but obviously this was coming for some time. So give me your sense of, was there a turning point? Was it a gradual boil? How did it play out?
Well, I think about one key moment for me was and I suppose it was about 2010. Glenn Beck had a big
Yeah,
event on the mall, the Restoring Honor, I think it was
yeah.
called, and had the black robed regiment of pastors and ministers who were going to stand with him. And I was noticing so many evangelical Christians saying, "Isn't it refreshing to hear Glenn Beck preaching the gospel?" And I was sitting here watching this. There was no gospel in this at all. It was just culture war politics. And I started to realize I think there are some people who can't tell the difference between these two things. And because politics just energizes people, it gives you a feeling of sort of life. And if there's lifelessness in other areas, it can really give you a jolt. And that becomes much more immediate to people than, say, character, virtue, forgiveness of sins. And so it becomes the animating factor, and then it goes from there. And so there's a sense of catastrophism,
Yeah.
which is, there are many people who will say, "Oh, well, private virtue related to public justice, that was true for a long time, but not in times like these. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and therefore that's what we have to do." So you have this sense of the culture is always right about to fall apart, which isn't a Christian view. I mean, a Christian view is the culture is always fallen from Eden forward. There's always going to be common grace and goodness out there in the culture, and there's always going to be fallenness. But this sense of everything out there is bad and everything in here, by definition. Yeah, I think of Willie Morris, old Mississippi author, who was talking about people in Yazoo City, Mississippi, where he's from, about the Vietnam War.
Mhm.
And he said it wasn't so much that they were pro war, it was that they were anti the people who were protesting the war.
Boy, do I understand that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that
Yeah.
made them more and more pro war. I think a similar dynamic often is at work. Many people assume, well, it's the pastors because they see some of these buffoonish figures, on television. That's not the case. In most cases, the pastors are actually good, reasonable people who are hanging on into some really difficult situations dealing with people in their congregations. And COVID just accelerated that because people were disconnected from one another, and it sort of put everybody under stress. So it took already existing realities and just knocked them through the roof.
It's that sense that the church is always under siege, and there were legitimate concerns about religious freedom and
Yeah.
conscience clause. But as you pointed out, and I think very powerfully, and again, this goes back to 2016, 2017, that religious freedom is very, very important, but it is at a means to an end.
Mhm.
And if you lose the sense of, okay, the end is the gospel and the Christian faith, you don't sacrifice all of that simply, to fight off to fight the culture wars. And I think that balance feels like it's been lost.
Yes, and to some degree, that has always been in there. I mean, I was a teenager in the '80s. In some of our classes, they would be playing records backwards to show us how there were secret hidden messages, and eventually you
Right.
realize that this isn't actually an accurate portrayal of the culture. But there was so much other there. But when that becomes the real animating factor, and when it starts to, it looks like conviction. Well, that's in Alberta's piece.
Hmm.
He talks about the growth that can happen. I've seen this happen 1,000 times, where you have a church that grew really fast during COVID because the pastor is talking about Bill Gates's conspiracies and so forth. That can grow. A lot of people will come for that. In the same way that, say, in the '80s, a lot of people would come to these churches that were tying biblical prophecy to current events and to the Cold War. I can tell you what the Soviet Union is going to do and why Mikhail Gorbachev is the Antichrist and so forth. People would flood into that. Now, people will flood in some places for that sort of thing because it looks like conviction. So someone's angry and riled up. It looks like, well, that's a fighter, and so people are drawn to that. So the pastors who are actually doing the work of Christ-like ministry, that's what some of them are up against.
So, what is the reaction? You mentioned things coming as a jolt. This report should have been a rather dramatic jolt for the Southern Baptist Convention. What is the fallout? What's going to happen? I noticed that you tweeted just a few days ago that Paige Patterson, who was fired for his comments, we talked about him earlier. That Paige Patterson was scheduled to be a pulpit guest at the First Baptist Dallas this
Yeah,
past Sunday, a week after
yeah,
this report was released. And you said you were thunderstruck,
I
absolutely
totally.
inexcusable and enraging. But what does that tell you? It certainly tells me that there are some people that are not reacting the way that you reacted to this report.
Well, that's true, but I don't think that that's the majority of people. And so, I mean, the encouraging thing to me is how this investigation even happened, which was because grassroots Southern Baptists came to the Southern Baptist Convention meeting and demanded it happen. Over and against a lot of these leaders who were saying you can't do this. So that's why it exists. So I really do have the sense that they are taking it seriously and will do the right thing. But there is a subset that even now will say this is just part of the liberalization of the Southern Baptist Convention. It just astounds me that saying rape and molestation is wrong somehow indicates liberalization. But there is a group that will say that, but I don't think they're going to win the day.
Okay, so there are like more than 700 cases that are documented here, and you were rebuked for calling this a crisis at one point, but now we know that the leaders knew that there was a crisis; they were documenting it themselves. You were right. When I read the back and forth between some of these presidents, high-ranking staff, and their lawyers, I cannot help but wonder what else this can be called but a criminal conspiracy. So are those people still in office? Are they still in their positions? Do they still run the convention?
Most of them are not, but most of them are not sort of after this investigation was commissioned. There were a lot of resignations and retirements that happened after the investigation was commissioned, and so that's the case, and it's just also the case, and this is a tragic thing. I mean, 1.1 million of us have left the Southern Baptist Convention over the last 3 years, and I get
1.1 million
yes,
have left.
have left.
It's amazing.
That's been
Okay.
the decline, and I think for most people, I know Beth Moore, not relation but
Right.
good friend. She and I both left around the same time, and I think it's unusual that a day goes by that we're not nostalgically reminiscing about our Southern Baptist childhoods and so forth. So these aren't people who wanted to leave, I don't think. And so it really does need to be addressed because a lot of people are exhausted at the politics, the infighting, and this sort of thing, where you have this majoring on these really minor issues while sweeping aside something that is huge, the abuse of vulnerable people. And that's huge. And that's swept aside while really, really minor issues are argued about constantly, and heresy trials are happening over those things.
So where did the million go?
Some of it is just the general loss of church membership in American life. You look at the rise of the no religious affiliation, the nuns people. A lot of them went to sort of non-denominational Bible churches or to other denominations. It's a variety of different places. And then there are people, I hear from people all the time who don't go to church and who desperately want to, but they've been hurt so badly that they don't know how to trust another congregation. And that to me is both heartbreaking and enraging at the people who would allow that situation to become what it has.
I think it was Peter Weiner who pointed out that no atheist has done as much to pry people away from the faith as these bad actors within the church themselves.
Exactly. This is over a sweep of 20 years. Over the past 25 years, I mean, one of the big things that the Southern Baptist Convention did was to boycott Disney
Right.
because Disney was tearing apart family values. And so we were going to take Disney down with this boycott. And then 3 years later, it was just sort of quietly abandoned because it hadn't done anything, it hadn't stopped any Southern Baptists from going to Disney World. But now you look back and you say, okay, the real cultural threat to our witness and to our churches was right there.
Right there.
It's on the inside.
Dr. Russell Moore, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. This has been an extraordinary discussion. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me.
The Bulwark podcast is produced by Katie Cooper with audio production by Jonathan Siri. I'm Charlie Sykes. Thank you for listening to today's Bulwark podcast, and we'll be back tomorrow to do this all over again.
There are about 1 million podcasts about money, but Bad with Money with Gabby Dunn is the one where finances meet social justice.
Investing in dating with Bella Gandhi.
Do you believe that people should pay for dating apps?
To me, invest in the dating process. There's nothing more important than finding the person you want to spend the rest of your life with. There's a stigma. Everything should be free. You're going to go to Whole Foods, meet eyes over mangoes, and all the dominoes fall in perfect order. That's just a load of garbage.
Bad with Money. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.